Okay. Um, on Monday, we left off talking about Baroque Spain. Remember that Baroque is this period that we associate with the 17th century that is dominated by an extremely dramatic approach to painting, right? And it began more or less with Italy, and in particular, we saw particularly Caravaggio, right, in Italy. And the reason it began in Italy is that this interest in drama, high impact drama in art, was a response to the Catholic Church's demand for what art should look like, which is that art should help the viewer in developing a sense of piety, right, a sense of religiosity. And that they had a certain set of demands, right? It needed to be clear and easy to understand. It needed to be realistic. And it needed to inspire the viewer, right? These are the things that the Catholic Church said were important for art. And we find then Caravaggio sort of answering that call in one particular way, being very, very popular, influencing artists everywhere. And as we move to Spain, which is also equally Catholic, right, very ardently Catholic, we find Caravaggio's influence to be particularly strong. Right? You would be forgiven in mistaking either of these pictures for Caravaggio because they follow his color palette, right? They follow his close-up, right, dramatic close-up, that lighting that comes from outside of the frame but sort of down at an angle from the corner. Right, all of these things are Caravaggio-esque, Caravaggio-like. And Velázquez would go to Italy eventually, but not by this point, right? He didn't go there until like the 1630s or something. So he's getting it, but he's getting it secondhand. Because Ribera, on the right, had been to Italy, right? He had been to Naples. He actually stayed there, which is one of the places that Caravaggio had lived. And he's sending pictures back to Spain that are influenced by Caravaggio, right? And this is how Spanish artists pick up on Caravaggio's influence. It's sort of secondhand through artists like Ribera. And that's in many ways for a lot of artists how they pick up Caravaggio's. They get it sort of secondhand, right? So Velázquez, even though this is not a religious picture, has certain Caravaggio elements. And we saw when we looked at Caravaggio that he did some non-religious pictures as well. He did some genre scenes of musicians, for example, right? And in this case, it's a scene of everyday life. It's a genre scene of a man selling water, right? Carrying water, delivering it around the city of Seville prior to plumbing. He's got this big old jar of cool water that he is now going to dispense through the terracotta jug on your left and the porcelain cup on top and that nice glass. And Velázquez seems very much to be showing off. This is what we ended up with, talking about at the very end of class, is he's showing off his talent. And at this point, he's relatively young. He's 20-ish at this point, right? And so he's making a career for himself. He's working in the city of Seville, which was the economic center of Spain. And that makes sense for an artist to be working there because where there's money, there's art patrons, right? But as we look at the image, we see all of these different textures, that he's so good at painting textures to the point where, as we talked about at the very end of class, you can see what parts of this unglazed jug in his hand, what parts are wet and which parts are dry. And I defy you to try to do that, right, with paint. To get you to understand the difference between those. So we can see where he splashed some water on the side of the jug. It's extraordinary. And if we look around, we realize that one of the things he's doing is he's demonstrating his ability to make paint look like different textures. And again, we've talked a couple times about how Baroque art very much appeals to all of your senses. That's part of that engagement with the viewer that the Catholic Church wanted, right? That oftentimes when we look at Baroque paintings, we can imagine hearing them. We can imagine touching the different surfaces. We can imagine smelling it and tasting it. And this picture is really kind of all about that, right? A fresh glass of water being drank in the back. It's really about engaging all of your senses in the work, right? So it's a bit of a demonstration piece, if you will. It's a bit of a masterpiece. The term masterpiece we use all the time now, but a masterpiece was in art a work of art where you demonstrated your mastery, right? And Velázquez seems to be showing off here. Now, as a genre scene, one of the things that comes up with Velázquez's painting is whether or not there's still this idea of a moral to the story, right? When we looked at Matthijs, we talked about a certain moralizing tendency, that there's some message here about how to behave, or maybe even how not to behave, right? Don't pretend to pray when you're really interested in money, right? Don't fake holiness. Yeah? There's an underlying message with it. And the question is, with the water carrier of Seville, do we still have something or not? Right? When we get to the 17th century, is there still metaphor, allegory, veiled meanings to a genre scene, a scene of everyday life? And with Velázquez's work, it becomes a little cloudy, a little difficult. It doesn't seem as if there's any overt moralizing tendencies here. At the same time, he gives us three different male figures from three different age groups. An older man handing water to a youthful boy, and someone who's between their ages drinking water in the shadows in the back. So while there might not be a moralizing tendency, there seems to be something more going on here. If we think about the metaphor of water as life, we've talked about that a couple times in class, the water of life, then the older generation is passing life to the younger generation. And the person who's between them in age, maturity if you will, is partaking in life. Right? There seems to be some bigger meaning here than just a sort of snapshot, if you will, of everyday life, right? There's a message. Is it moralizing still? Is it telling us how to behave? I'm not so sure, right? But it is a very thoughtful piece, right? Velázquez has worked out everything, not just the different textures and how the old craggy flesh of the man relates to the unglazed terracotta jar that he touches, or how the smooth skin of the boy relates to the smooth glass that he holds. He's worked this all through. And all of that is part of this idea that perhaps it's a demonstration piece. Now, the reason we think that is that from the town of Seville, one of Velázquez's friends in Seville had recently got a job as an advisor to the King of Spain in Madrid. And Velázquez gives him this picture and says, would you please show this to the king? Right? And so his friend takes it, shows it to King Philip IV, the King of Spain. And Philip sort of says, I've got some artists working for me, but I think I can find a place for him. Right? And hires Velázquez because of this picture. Right? So he's demonstrated his talent to the king. The king has said, this is a great idea. Right? I want you working for me. And Velázquez, sorry about that. I can see something here has gone wonky. There we go. There's Philip IV, the King of Spain. Velázquez becomes his official court portrait painter, right? 1620-ish, 2021. He begins painting for Philip, right? So this is now the King of Spain, and this is a portrait by Velázquez, and he will spend the next 30 to 40 years of his life living in Madrid at the court of King Philip IV of Spain, right? As his official portrait painter. What is he like, Philip IV, about Velázquez? Well, certainly he's a great painter. He's terrific at creating texture, right? Adding drama to works. That probably is all very attractive. In this case, a portrait of the king. It's as if we've been granted audience with him. We've asked to come and see him. In fact, there's a little note in his hand that is our request to visit him, right? We've written to him and said, here I am, Bill, I'm here to visit, and he's holding it now, and he's happy to meet you, right? So he's dropped everything. He doesn't really look like a king, right? He looks more like a gentleman, right? A businessman, if you will. But certainly now the King of Spain has sort of let his guard down for you. You're friends with him, right? You get audience. And that, I think, certainly that idea of bringing some narrative to portraiture is something that would have appealed to him. The other thing that appealed to Philip the Fourth, the King of Spain, is Velázquez's ability to make him look better than he really looked. Now, you might look at him and think he's one ugly coot anyway, right? And he is. He's a member of the Habsburg family, and they're notoriously ugly, right? Really ugly group of people. And part of the ugliness came from the fact that they were inbreeding. They were marrying within the family to strengthen the dynasty. And that's not uncommon in earlier centuries, to find marriages having nothing to do with love and having everything to do with diplomacy, right? And in order to sort of shore up the edges of inheritance, one of the things that many early families did were to be married cousins and whatnot, right? And in the Habsburgs, they were notorious for this, right? And Philip IV was the inheritor now of about 150 years of frighteningly close inbreeding, and came out with this Habsburg face, right? So I don't know why it says Habsburg twice, but it does. Puffy lips, heavy jowls, jutting chin, and that sort of longish, horsey nose, right? These are all Habsburg features. Now, you might say, well, why didn't Velázquez make him look better? It's not a photograph, after all, right? It's an official likeness. You know how they say you would never recognize George Washington if you saw him because the dollar bill doesn't look anything like him, right? It's an idealized portrait, right? It's the official version of what he looks like, right? In a pre-photographic age. So why didn't Velázquez sort of make him look better than this? Well, the bottom line is that he did, right? This is the X-ray of the painting. And his cheeks were fuller, right? The mouth more like Marlon Brando in The Godfather, as it was full of cotton or something, right? And what Velázquez was able to do was to flatter Philip with portraiture, which all portraits should do anyway, right? The point of a portrait is to flatter the sitter. And Velázquez was able to do that and became Philip's favorite court portrait painter from the 1620s onward, right? Lived at court, surrounded by the royal collection of paintings, which we'll talk a little bit more about later today. Well, being a Habsburg, one of the things that we find is that the majority of his family suffered from this dynastic inbreeding. So, for example, he had I got to get my facts straight on this. Got to look at my notes for this because I don't have it memorized entirely, right? He had 8 children prior to the daughter here that we see, Infanta Margarita. And all but one of them had died either in childbirth or very, very young. So when Margarita was born, he has one surviving daughter, and that's it, one older sister. And Margarita, when she's born, of course, there's great expectation that she too might die, because really 1 in 8 chance, right, of living at that point. And she lives. And not only does she live, but she's actually cute as a button, right, which is rare for a Habsburg. She's actually beautiful, because most of them have the Habsburg features, even the girls do, right? So Philip IV couldn't be happier when Margarita comes out. A, beautiful, B, healthy, right? Which for him is extraordinarily important, right? So here is little Margarita, and this is again a painting by Velázquez, part of his role as court portrait painter, right? It's a portrait of Margarita surrounded by her entourage. And that's what Las Meninas means in Spanish. The ladies in waiting, right? They're her court attendants. So the term Las Meninas refers to Margarita and the 2 women on either side of her, the 2 girls on either side of her. Her playmates, right? Those are the Meninas of this particular image. And we see them posing in Velázquez's studio, his room in the palace. Now, he doesn't have a purpose-built studio, right? Philip IV gives him one of the rooms in the palace, and we know which room it is, actually. And we can tell from this picture which room in the palace it was. And he gives him a palace, high ceilings and whatnot. Some pictures from the royal collection, they're on the wall in the background. A nicely lit room, and this is where Velázquez will paint. And he gives us this image of Margarita surrounded by her entourage, some chaperones in the back, a guard at the door, and Velázquez in a self-portrait on the left, caught in the act of painting. He paints himself painting, right? So on a certain level, Velázquez, and here he's been working for Philip for 35 years, right? Really in tight with Philip, right? He and Philip are actually more than just employer-employee. They become friends over the years, right? And he, we assume, gets this commission to paint Margarita and throws himself in there as a subtext, right? As a secondary theme. So he shares the stage with her so that the picture is as much about her. She's focused. She's in the center. He gives us sort of quasi-Caravaggio lighting, but it's coming through the window, right? It makes it more realistic. And she's highlighted there in the foreground, but he's there too. He's every bit as important as part of the picture because she's doing nothing and he's working, right? And he's staring right out at you. We should assume right out at Philip, right? Because this was painted for Philip IV. And we know, in fact, that the painting was set up, and it's huge. We'll see a picture of it in situ in a second. It was set up in his office, so when Philip was sitting at his desk taking notes or writing letters like you guys are, he'd look up and he would see this on the far wall, right? His favorite daughter, the miracle child, right? With her entourage, and Velázquez, Diego Velázquez, painting in the act of painting, right? So there she is, right? Little Infanta Margarita. And staring directly at us, very coy, being attended by two of her servants. One of them looks directly at her. The other one looks out toward us, kind of mysteriously, right? There's something about this picture that really takes into account the viewer. We have roughly, how many people are looking directly at you in this picture as they engage with each other? Velázquez is, Margarita is, the attendant to the right is, the dwarf to her right is, right? The man in the shadows behind her is, the guy at the door is, right? All these people are addressing you, engaging you. You participate in the image. That's a very Baroque idea, again, to get the viewer to participate, right? It came out of religious ideas, but it translates into secular pictures as well. So there's little Margarita looking at us, and look what's behind her, over her head. There's a mirror. Can you make that out? Because you can see directly above it and on the sides of it, there are framed paintings, but the mirror glows, right? It reflects light. And so it appears very different on the wall. It's not a painting on the wall by any means. It's a mirror on the wall. And lo and behold, who's in the mirror? It's actually Philip with his wife, Mariana of Austria. Right? They are actually reflected in the mirror in the background, right? Now, Mariana was his second wife, right? She's the mother of Infanta Margarita. She's also Philip's niece. Ew, right? I mean, this is the inbreeding I was talking about, right? His second wife, Mariana, is a Habsburg, and she looks all the part, right? And they are uncle and niece, not even once removed or anything, right? Now, all of these figures, this sort of full-length portrait of people looking out at us with a mirror in the background reflecting two people, does that remind you of anything? Just as a concept of a portrait with a mirror in the background and an interesting reflection in the mirror? The Van Eyck, exactly right. The Arnolfini wedding, right? Or the Arnolfini and his wife. That painting belonged to Philip IV at this time, right? That was in his collection. So, or in the family collection. So Velázquez would have known it, right? Would have known about it. And he sort of adopted some of those artifices so that when you look back there, what you see in the mirror is something that actually adds some visual interest to it, right? So we see instead of Van Eyck the painter, which is what we saw in the back of the Arnolfini, we see now the owner of the work, Philip and his wife, looking in. Okay? Now, there are some sort of interesting things about this that we'll sort of talk about in order, right? But the idea is, of course, that when Philip is sitting where you are and he looks up, he sees himself in that mirror, right? Because it's meant to address him. And he sees himself included within the picture. But it's somewhat problematic, right? So like I mentioned, all these people are also looking at him, right? He sees himself in the picture, but all these other people that Velázquez, including Velázquez himself, are looking directly at Philip. There's two dwarves on the right. The 17th century Europe was not particularly enlightened, right, about human rights and whatnot. And most European courts kept dwarves as entertainers, right? So these are court attendants, also dwarves, and there's a little boy with him. When you read the literature on this, he says he's kicking the dog, but I've got dogs, and I know what he's doing. He's scratching it, right? He's getting gitchy goo on its butt, because dogs love to have their butt scratched. I mean, it's just, they go crazy for that. And the little boy is scratched, and that dog is not upset, right? He's got that face that, right, when he's getting his back scratched. And so the little boy is playing with the dog, right, and scratching its back. And it's a sort of charming little engaging detail. By the way, I saw this one time, I saw this really great talk at a conference that talked about dogs in art and dog breeding and the history of dog breeding. And Spanish are known for mastiffs. That's a Spanish breed, is a bull mastiff. These big monster hunting dogs are typically Spanish dogs. But there's a dog breed out there that we call Spanish that isn't, called the Spaniel. Cocker Spaniels, right, are named after the Spanish. And this talked about the fact that the name was given by the English when they were at war with Spain, to make the Spanish not be big, burly, muscular hunting dogs, but to be stupid little lap dogs, right? So it was a very political naming. So now if you ever get a Spaniel, realize that the name Spaniel was given to the dog to demean the Spanish, right, by the English who were at war with them in the 17th century. So nice little tidbit. Art history tells you everything you ever need to know about anything in the world, right? So everybody's looking at Philip, right, in the picture. Not everybody, all but really 2 or 3 of them are looking at Philip, including Velázquez himself, right? Now, when I talk about Velázquez being somewhat audacious by including himself in a portrait of Philip's daughter, it's even more audacious because he's not dressed properly to be painting. Normally, when you paint, you wear an apron, a smock. And even in the 17th century, you would wear sort of a robe that you can get paint all over, because it's a dirty little activity, right? But he's dressed in extraordinarily fine clothing with a crested jacket. He's dressed as a courtier, a member of court, a gentleman, an aristocrat, even though he's in the act of painting. So that begins to establish a theme for this picture that it's as much about Velázquez and his status as it is about Margarita and Philip, right? This is a self-portrait as much as anything else, and he's showing off, to a certain degree, his newfound status. Not newfound anymore, he's been doing it for 35 years, but this new status he has as court painter, which in Spain was important because Spanish artists at the beginning of the 17th century were considered to be nothing more than craftsmen, right? Like a window maker or a chair maker or a saddle maker. They're just craftsmen. And Velázquez is saying, no. Art is important. Art makes me a gentleman. Art makes me an aristocrat. Art gives me status. And he paints himself not as a craftsman, but as an aristocrat in the act of painting. And he's looking now directly at Philip as he paints. Right? With that idea that part of what Velázquez has presented to Philip is a painting about painting. Right? It's a painting about the status of the artist as painter, as court painter. the pictures on the wall behind him we can actually identify. They came out of the Royal Collection. They're roughly contemporary. They're fairly new pictures, right? They're 17th century pictures. And each one of them shows an image of humans creating, and by doing so, rivaling the power of the gods, right? Contests where humans say, I can play music better than the gods. I can create better than the gods can. That creativity elevates your status beyond mere mortals to become like God. That seems to be very much one of Velázquez's themes that he's working with here. So even though he's off to the side, and even though she's highlighted, this picture has a lot of things in it that are about creativity, right? The importance of artistic creativity, which is trying to, again, shatter the tradition, right? Trying to move artists into a new position in society, not just as court artists, but in general. Now, another interesting thing about that, there's the picture in situ. It's huge, right? In Madrid. I've never been. My wife said when I turned 60 in a year and a half, that I can go anywhere I want. And I'm thinking Madrid, because I've never seen this, right? Problem is my birthday's in the summer, and I don't want to go to Madrid in the summer because there's too many people. Anyway, long and the short of it is, what's interesting about seeing the picture on the wall in Madrid is that the painting that Velázquez is painting is about the size of the painting we're looking at. Does that make sense? So it's almost as if Velázquez gives us the idea that what we're looking at is Velázquez making the painting that we're looking at. Right? Is that loopy enough for you? That he's actually painting what we're looking at. So instead of Philip sitting out here, and we imagine this space that incorporates everything, right? Instead, there's a mirror out here, right? And Velázquez is over here behind the, right, getting it right, and they're all looking at the mirror as well, and he kind of captures this sense of it just being a moment, right? Not really posed, but sort of capturing life happening, right? So it's a kind of interesting picture this way, because it's all about the fact that what the artist creates is based on reality, but it's its own reality. Does that make sense? And so if he's looking at a mirror, if a mirror is out here that he's painting to paint the picture that we're looking at, right? And how he gets to the top is beyond me. There must be a ladder back there somewhere, right? But if he's painting the picture that we're looking at, then how do we account for Philip in the mirror? It gets wonky on us, right? It's really weird. He's created this world with his own internal logic, right? This world that things don't quite work out. Yeah? And some people have suggested, first and foremost, right? I found this out about 5 years ago, so I know some people know this. Any reflection in any mirror, and I have to test this to make sure it's true. Any reflection in any mirror is exactly half the size of the thing that's reflected. It doesn't matter how far away from the mirror you are. Do it sometime. Take it to Sharpie, right? Any reflection in any mirror, this is a physical property, is half the size of the thing that's reflected. So that means in that mirror, if we double Philip's size, he should be standing about where Velázquez is. Right? Doubling. He should be right in here somewhere. Not out where you are. Right? So there's something weird about that mirror in the background that doesn't really reflect. And I think for Velázquez, this is a key element. Paintings reflect reality better than mirrors do, right? Or differently than mirrors do. The artist creates a world that isn't a direct reflection of the world around it, right? It behaves on its own rules. It's based on his creativity. And so the fact that the mirror in the background poses questions, right, doesn't resolve. It's part of Velázquez's message. Art transcends the physical world, right? It doesn't have to follow the rules anymore because it's art, after all, right? So that portrait in the background is a very, very strange thing. I love how he's painted it. Right? Velázquez is really good about manipulating sharpness of focus. So you can even see this in the figures in the foreground. Little Margarita is just sharply in focus, particularly her face. But the figures in the shadow on the back, the two chaperones, right? They're kind of fuzzy and out of focus. And we're used to this in our cameras, right? With depth of field. So if you can focus on something in the foreground and things in the background get out of focus. But Velázquez didn't have cameras. He doesn't know this, right? But he figures out the way in which he can direct you to look at what he wants you to look at, which is her, right? She's even slightly more focused than the painter himself is. But the figures in the mirror are fully out of focus, right? They're blurry, yet it still ends up looking very much like the luminosity of a mirror. And you'll notice that next to them is this red curtain that's been pulled aside, almost as if they come through, right? A doorway that's covered with a curtain. Come in. Well, this element, which might seem inconsequential, is something that we see in portraits all the time in the 17th century. It's a standard artifice for a painted portrait, to show the figure standing there with a curtain pulled back. Right? Here's one by Velázquez. Okay? On my screen there is. Here's one by Velázquez of Mariana. Right? The niece wife of Philip IV. And you can see that same curtain sort of pulled back. So, if Velázquez is creating this room where physics, right, don't apply, could the mirror be reflecting what he's painting instead? Then they'd be about the right size if he's painting a full-size portrait of them, right? They'd be the same size as him. But the problem is that the mirror looks like it's flat on the wall, which means that's kind of wonky again, right? To have it reflect the painting he's making. But Velázquez does this. He's playing with the idea that the world he creates is his world, right? It is beholden only to the creativity of the artist, right? And it's such an extraordinarily mysterious picture, so to this day, in the way in which Velázquez is taking what was originally a very simple commission, portrait of his daughter, and turned it into something unique, special, that is as much a testament to Velázquez's own place at court as a painter as it is a portrait of little Margarita, tended by her group. Now, with this idea that he's really extolling his role as a painter, one of the things about Velázquez is his ability to sort of play with the medium of paint. So almost all of our artists, when we look at the paintings, we really become very much aware, and so far with this, we've been talking about the painting is a representation, right? So a painting is, it's a girl surrounded by her attendants with the painter. So painting exists as a representation. And when we talk about it as a representation of something else, right? But a painting is something apart from that. A painting is a bunch of paint on a canvas, right? So a painting is a representation, but a painting is also an object. That makes sense? Right? So on one hand, when we look at this, we're looking at Velázquez creating a little world with these rules that are strange and don't obey the normal rules of physics and so forth. But on the other hand, Velázquez is creating this surface covered with color. Right? And as we look at Velázquez's application of the paint, it's extraordinary in its looseness, its freshness, its sketchiness, the range of finishes. He captures hands in motion like a blurry photograph. And he has no idea about photographs that have been in 1820 or so, right? So way before that, but he gets this idea of trying to capture motion. Look at the hand versus the little tea. They're playing tea service, right? So she's got a little teacup on it. But look at the difference between the hand and the tea surface. The tea surface is more sharp-edged, right? But at the same time, when you look at the tea surface and the sleeve of Infanta Margarita behind it, right? At a certain point, it starts to break apart, and you see these brushstrokes that look abstract. They don't look like anything up close. You can't tell that's a rough up a sleeve. But then you back away and you look at the other one, and yeah, it all works. Right? There's this back and forth between the freshness of the painting. And what we end up seeing, when we look at Velázquez close up, and this is something we see in a lot of Baroque art, are these traces of what it meant to make the work. We see the artist at work. Right? We can trace where he's been. He leaves us signs of the fact that this is a creation of a particular moment, of a particular activity of the artist. And everywhere we look through this, right, are these flashes of paint that haven't been blended. Right? Van Eyck, when he creates those extraordinarily realistic details, we look up close, we really don't see brushstrokes. Because he takes every one and he'll lay on colors next to each other, and then he'll come back and he'll smooth them out, he'll blend them together, he'll rub them, not with his fingers, but with a brush, right? He'll blend them out. Velázquez makes it look as if it's unfinished almost, as if we can see it coming into being. Now, if you know anything, you've heard of the Impressionists. Yes. 19th century French painters try to achieve the same effect, but it's not until like 1860 or so that they figured this out. That's 200 years later, right? Well, it turns out that in France, in Paris in particular, there was a brand new gallery opened of Spanish paintings. And they started to look at Velázquez. And they started to see these things and go, oh my goodness, what a way of capturing a fleeting moment in time. Which is what they're all about, right? Velázquez gives them answers to questions they'd already been asking. And we get these places where you can see it, the whites in this, right? Just these flashing dabs of white. But some of that came out of looking at El Greco, right? We kind of saw some of that with El Greco when we looked at it. But Velázquez pushes it significantly further. Here's the brooch on Margarita's chest, and you can see that some of the paint sits up on the canvas, some of it's fairly thin, but at the same time, up close, it ends up looking like a 1950s abstract painting, right? But then we back away, and it turns into that flower. Velázquez is this extraordinary virtuoso with how he actually puts the paint on the canvas, leaving it loose, leaving it unbroken. Now I mentioned some of this comes out of El Greco, who had worked in Spain, had been in Seville, where he started painting, right? But the other artist who's influential on Velázquez this way is Titian, the great Venetian painter Titian. Titian had been court painter to Philip IV's great grandfather, 4 generations back, right? And had spent some time in Spain, and Titian's paintings are everywhere in the Spanish Royal Collection. One of the biggest Titian collections in the world is in Madrid. And Velázquez, when he's doing court painters, hanging out with these things, right? He knows Titian forwards and backwards. And when we looked at this particular painting by Titian, we saw that same sort of flashy brush strokes that are unblended, especially in the velvet down by her wrist, right? Velázquez has been looking at this now for 30 years, or works like this for 30 years, right? And he's picked up on those ideas, and he's developed them even further, right? So an extraordinary painter, but we're going to find as we look at more and more Baroque art, is the sense of drama, the sense of immediacy, the sense of engagement that Baroque artists are trying to aim for. Part of that translates into making a painting that is loose and open-ended and vibrant and almost like it's still alive, to engage you, the viewer, in looking at it. So now we're going to shift our focus away from Spain. We're going to move up north, so to speak, to Flanders. Now, so we're going to look at the Baroque still. We're going to look at 17th century art and what's going on in Flanders, right? We talked about Flanders a couple times in the past, right? It's what's today Belgium, yeah? And it was where Van Eyck had been working, right, prior to the period that we're talking about, right? It's the region of Van Eyck, the region of Bruegel, the region of Quentin Matsys, right? And this region came under control of Spain by the 17th century. I won't test you on this, but I'll give you some background, right, just to let you know, right? So remember that Van Eyck had been court painter to Philip the Bold. No, sorry, let's just say Philip the Good. My bad. My bad, good. Should say good, right? Had been court painter to Duke Philip the Good. See how easy it is to get these things confused, right? Philip the Good's granddaughter, Mary of Burgundy, right? He didn't have a grandson. His granddaughter, Mary of Burgundy, married into the Habsburg family. She married the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. And it's important to remember, and this is a key thing for us, historically speaking, the Renaissance and the Baroque eras, the 16th, 17th century in particular, going all the way back to the 15th century, right, is an era of marriage diplomacy, particularly among the royal houses, but also amongst aristocrats, is that you would not marry particularly for love, you would marry for power. You would marry to consolidate or gain power. So, Mary of Burgundy's father, Philip the Good's son, arranged the marriage between her and the Holy Roman Emperor because he wants to be Holy Roman Emperor. Dies too young to make it work, right? So, Mary of Burgundy marries the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I, who is a member of the Habsburg family. That means that the control of the Netherlands goes to the Habsburg family, 1478, right? This big wedding. Their son, Duke Philip the Fair, who is also a Habsburg now, right? Inheritor of the Habsburg bloodline, marries the Princess of Spain, Joanna of Castile, in 1494, right? So what happens is, with these two steps, Flanders, which had been once part of the French throne, had become independent from that during the 100 Years' War, right? Been very, very successful, very, very prosperous, had gone from being independent to being controlled by Spain, right? And so instead of calling it Flanders, we call it the Spanish Netherlands. And that's what that's what it was referred to in the 17th century, what it continued to be referred to even into the 18th century, the Spanish Netherlands, right? Netherlands just means Low Countries. And that refers to what's today Belgium. Okay? Now, this is all really important for us because the politics of this period, when Spain, which we're just looking at, is now controlling modern Belgium, the politics of this erupts in the Baroque era, right? So by Bruegel's time, right, this era is totally controlled by the Spanish, all right? And they're fairly good with it so far because many of the leaders, even though they're living in Spain, had been born in the Low Countries. They're kind of cool with that so far. But in the 1560s, this explodes. Okay? What happened in Europe is Protestantism, a challenge to the Catholic Church. We've talked about this before, right? That after Martin Luther in 1517 and the spread of his protests, Protestantism, right, the Reformation, what we find is Europe begins to polarize between the Protestants on the one hand and the Catholics on the other. And that interior tensions between different regions take on religious overtones. So what might have been politically a problem becomes more of a problem because of religious differences. Okay? Protestantism is isolated primarily in Germany, what is today Germany, Switzerland, and spreads from there to the Low Countries, to the Netherlands. The Spanish Netherlands. Right? So that by the 1560s, there is a growing Protestant population in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, on the other hand, the King of Spain is pretty deeply Catholic. right? Very deeply Catholic. So there's a split coming, right? So not only do the people in the Low Countries feel that they're being governed by a foreign power, right? By Bruegel's time, the King of Spain never once visited the Low Countries, even though he's in control of it. So they felt foreign domination. And on the other hand, he's Catholic and they're Protestant. And he's moving increasingly toward outlawing Protestantism, making Catholic the official religion of the Low Countries. This is inflaming tension. Okay? In 1566, there's an outbreak of iconoclasm in the Low Countries. Now, iconoclasm, the destruction of images, that's what that word means. We use it more broadly these days for anybody that sort of questions authority, right? There's a Lifetime network or something, the iconoclasts, right? The people who sort of break traditions. But the term literally means destruction of images, right? Klasm is destruction, cataclysm comes from the same word, right? Icon is image, right? Iconoclasm is destruction of images. And in the aftermath of Martin Luther, we find a lot of Protestants clinging significantly more closely to the written word of the Bible. And in the Ten Commandments, the second commandment says, make no images. They coupled this with the first commandment, worship no other gods before me. And they decided that imagery led to idolatry, the worshiping of idols. And they used as their example the children of Israel dancing around the golden calf when Moses comes down with the Ten Commandments, right? That you shouldn't worship idols, and that by looking at them leads to that. So there was an outbreak on many occasions in Europe in the 16th century of what we call iconoclasm. And there was a huge outbreak in the Low Countries in 1566. Here is a print made 20 years later or so that details this destruction of images inside a church. Right? The King of Spain, who is not living in the Low Countries but is in control of it, wants this to stop. So he dispatches troops to stop the rioters in Antwerp and various other places in the Low Countries, right, under his realm. This becomes known by the people of the Low Countries as the Spanish Fury. So the Spanish king, Philip II, he's the great-great-great-great-grandson of Philip the Good. They're all Philips, right? And he's the great-grandfather of Philip IV, Velazquez's king, right? He unleashes troops. They go in and they start to just wreak havoc. They kill everybody, right? There are a couple of ways you can stop rioting, but they go for the mean one, right? And the Dutch and the Flemings to this day refer to this as the Spanish Fury, right? He clamps down on iconoclasm, and this begins a war between the Low Countries and Spain, right? Known as the 80 Years' War, because literally it lasts 80 years. Right? The war is not concluded until 1648. So after the Spanish Fury, war breaks out in 1568. And the war is, on one hand, against foreign government, but the war is, on the other hand, Protestants versus Catholics. Right? And this leads to a break between the Spanish Netherlands, modern Belgium, which stays Catholic, and the northern part, the United Provinces, which becomes Holland, right, which is Protestant. And the front is the borderline between them. Right? So, during the 80 Years' War, the Spanish Netherlands, Flanders, modern Belgium, is still allied with Spain. And all of the Protestants that were living there move north. There is a negative birth rate. I just found this out last week. There was a negative birth rate in the 17th century in the North Netherlands, the United Provinces. But population tripled. even with a negative birth rate, because there's so many immigrants coming in from the southern Netherlands, from the Spanish Netherlands, fleeing the intolerance of the Spanish king. Right? There's a lot of not art in our art history right here. But this is an important thing to keep in the back of your mind, is that the Baroque period that we were just talking about with Spain, all of the stuff that we saw in Spain is created while Spain is actively at war, even though we saw none of that. Right? Actively at war against the independence movement of the Netherlands, the United Provinces. And this is all being fought on religious lines. So far in the Baroque, we're going to be moving now to Flanders. This will be our third country we've looked at, and it will be our third Catholic country as well. Right? It's an important part to remember, is that the Flanders remains Catholic. Right? Now, the primary center here is Antwerp still, just as it had been in the 16th century. It's the economic center of the Spanish Netherlands, Flanders. And the primary painter in the 17th century, in the Baroque period in Flanders, is Rubens. And I would argue that even though up to this point we've talked about the importance of Caravaggio as a painter, I would also argue that maybe even eclipsing Caravaggio, that Rubens is maybe the most important painter of the 17th century period. We'll sort of talk about how that all works out, right? So he's from Antwerp in Flanders. He's Catholic, right? He's going to spend a hunk of his career there. But in 1600, he travels to Italy. Most artists would travel to Italy. There's a great reason for artists to go to Italy. Right? And it's not Caravaggio only. They may not even know a Caravaggio. It's a surprise when they get there. Right? But what they did know was Michelangelo, Raphael. Right? They knew the Italian Renaissance, ancient Rome, and all of the ruins and the statues from ancient Rome. This is why artists would go, was to see the great art of the past. And in 1600, Rubens decides to go to Italy as well. So he's there when Caravaggio is active. And yet, he comes out without a whiff of Caravaggio. He doesn't care. Of all the artists that we've seen that go to Italy, many of them come back just like, wow, Caravaggio's it. Rubens comes back with no influence of Caravaggio at all. There's no sort of Caravaggio color schemes. There's no Caravaggio lighting, no staginess, right? Sometimes he'll do dramatic close-ups, but you would never really mistake a Rubens for a Caravaggio, except maybe for the activity. But beyond that, there ain't much. Rubens gives us action. Rubens is a painter of extraordinary vigor and action. And he gives us the scene, Phaeton. Do you know who Phaeton is, other than a Volkswagen model? He's the son of Apollo, the god of the sun. Right? So he's the son of the sun god. S-O-N of the S-U-N. Right? The son of the sun god. And according to Roman mythology, Apollo drives the sun across the sky. Right? He's the one that makes it move from horizon to horizon. Right? And according to mythology, the sun is a chariot that Apollo drives that's drawn by 4 horses. Which is, by the way, exactly how Roman emperors appeared when they appeared in parades, was in a chariot with 4 horses. So you would look at the Roman emperor and you would think, he's Apollo. Right? Phaeton is the son of Apollo. And one night he steals the keys to the car, so to speak. Right? He wants to drive the chariot. But of course, only Apollo can drive the chariot. Right? Only Apollo's supposed to drive it, and only Apollo's skilled enough to drive it because it moves so quickly through the sky. Right? So Phaeton takes the chariot, goes out for a drive, and he wrecks it. Right? And for his hubris Do you know that word, right? For his lofty thinking he's above his station. He ends up falling from the sky, right? And so here we see the wreck of Apollo's chariot and the horses just being scattered, the moon above it, right? The sun flying off somewhere, beams coming down. And Rubens filling the entire composition with these flailing horses and humans everywhere we look, and filling the entire picture with an extraordinary sense of drama, right? This picture's not very big. It's about like this, right down in the National Gallery. But it seems bigger. It seems so dramatic and over the top, right? But we're looking up in the heavens, and we just see all of these spilling figures everywhere, this high sense of sort of busy drama, right? And it's not like Caravaggio. It's his own take on this whole interest in drama thing. That's part of the Baroque. Now, like I say, he painted this when he's in Italy, right? He had altarpiece commissions when he was in Italy as well. He was very active for about 10 years in Italy at exactly the same time as Caravaggio. And when someone was asking about late Baroque art and how busy it was and where did this come from, it's certainly not Caravaggio. This comes from Rubens, right? This sense of theatricality, this sense of the busy, writhing pile of figures is a Rubens thing. So when we talk about who's influential, who's really driving the Baroque period, right? Caravaggio certainly has a huge impact all over Europe. But so does Rubens, right? Rubens is, I think, in many ways, every bit as important. And when we look at late Baroque art in Italy, like Gauli's Triumph in the Name of Jesus, this comes out of Rubens. He is hyper-dramatic, not stagey dramatic, just hyper-activity in all of his works. 1609, he comes back to Antwerp. He was planning on staying the rest of his life. He liked it in Italy. But his mom got sick. Right? He came home to be a good son. She died almost immediately, but he came home, sets up shop in Antwerp. This is where he's going to stay for most of the rest of his career. It'll be his home base at least. You can still, if you go to Antwerp, visit his house. Right? It still stands in Italy, or in Antwerp. And he begins to get major commissions that he channels his sense of drama into. This is a huge altarpiece for one of the side chapels in the cathedral in Antwerp. And it shows the moment when Christ is being crucified. Now, it's not the crucifixion, right? It's more dramatic than that. In an image of the crucifixion, Christ is just there. He's just hanging there, right? But in this case, it's the moment when the cross is being raised up, right? It's an active moment. So they've dug a post hole. They're guiding the foot of the cross into that post hole. And if you think about the image and Christ there hanging on the cross, waiting to sort of jump into that hole, there's this sense of it trying to engage with you more physically, because he's already resting on those nails, but at a certain point that cross is going to pound into the bottom of that hole, and he's going to hit on those nails even more, and he wants you to sense this, and he wants you to feel this as well. And he also is able to activate it more by the fact that it's being raised and sort of moved from left to right, that you got that extraordinary diagonal that runs through the composition from upper left to lower right, right? That also adds activity. Look back at the Fall of Faith and the strong diagonal that goes the opposite direction there, that organizes the composition. Diagonals make your eye move. Horizontals and verticals lock things into place. It's a standard, 2D design principle about diagonals versus horizontals and verticals. And Rubens understands this. Right? We get St. John and the Virgin Mary on the left. She's weeping again, like we see so many other times. The women of Jerusalem who have followed him on the way to Calvary in the lower corner. On the right-hand side, this is a triptych, right? These wings fold. We see the soldiers directing the torture of Christ, and we see the thieves that will be crucified on either side of Christ in the background behind the horse. Right? Now, this is a monster painting, right? Just to give you a sense of scale, right? Where it is in Antwerp today. That the body of Christ is about twice life size, right? I think that if you were to stand up next to him, you'd come up basically a little bit past his navel if you put his feet next to his, right? And that's part of its engagement. That's part of its attempt to engage you, the viewer. Remember that Baroque art, particularly religious art, has a duty to fulfill for the church, and that is to reach out and grab you as a viewer. Drama is part of that, right? Engaging your senses is part of that. But scale is also part of that. Right? These are overwhelming in size alone, let alone overwhelming in sort of musculature as well, right? And Rubens adds all these touches that are meant specifically to reach out to you. So our centurion with the horse looks directly at us, right? And we can almost hear it clomping and winnowing, and because it's drooling, right? Capturing these realistic details. We see the spittle coming from the horse as he helps us to sort of, he knows we're there, right? When you're being watched, when you know you're being watched, you behave differently, right? You're more engaged. I might argue that Gabrielle in the front, if I were to give you the entire lecture from here, it would be a very different learning experience, right? But that's because that proximity of engagement. And I won't do that to you either, right? I won't give you spittle either. But that helps us to sort of pull us in, right? Make you pay attention because it addresses your presence there. You're not just inert. And in the foreground, in front of Christ, we see this great image of, there's a spaniel for us, right? Barking at Jesus. And you hear this picture, right? You see the wind blowing, the clouds darkening, the eclipse about to happen, because the Bible tells us that it got dark when Jesus died, right? But there's a sense that all of our senses are engaged with this picture one way or another. Touch, taste, smell, sound, in addition to simply seeing, right? We're there. And as Rubens tries to engage us, he gives us these figures right down in the foreground that lean out toward us that are extraordinarily huge. I mean, who looks like this, right? World Wrestling Federation guys, when they're younger, look like this, These are extraordinary muscles on these figures. And part of that is, and it's three guys here, not counting the old man, how many people does it take to lift Jesus' cross? 10-ish, right? More than a few. And for Rubens, this is an important point, right? Jesus is bearing the weight of the world. Jesus on the cross right now is carrying the sins of mankind on his shoulders, theologically speaking. It should be no easy task to raise the cross. And Rubens amplifies that idea by showing us that the people who are raising the cross are these weightlifters, because they have to raise the weight of the world, right? It's not just Jesus. And when we look at Jesus, and we look at the body of Christ, right, and how he's arranged that, there's something about him that is triumphant, despite the fact that he's about to die. Rubens wants us to think about the fact that he's carrying the weight of the world, but none of that means anything unless he rises from the dead. Right? So we're seeing the moment when he's about to die, but we're also seeing a foretelling of what's going to happen. He's like the touchdown Jesus. He's Rocky at the top of the steps of the Philadelphia Museum, jumping up and down. Right? He is arms over his head. He's going to triumph over this, right? And Rubens wants us to remember that element. Excuse me. The body of Christ is no less muscular, right? Because again, he has to bear the weight of the world. And I love in this particular detail how Christ is looking up to heaven for his salvation. The realism of the blood running down his arms, which again is that sense of palpability, right? But I also like how he juxtaposes the clean white flesh of Jesus, soft but muscular, with the darkened skin of the man who's directly next to him, right? This is Rubens showing us good versus bad, good versus evil. Jesus is essentially good, and his tormentors are essentially even almost has demon ears, doesn't he? Like they're pointy. And there is this thing in visual art that bald people are bad, right? James Bond villains, Austin Powers, right? Dr. Evil. The guy in the first Indiana Jones movie when they had the fist fight in the plane, and he's this big, he looks just like that guy. He's this big, burly, bald guy, right? The shaved head is this thing that kind of can be used as a way of sort of signaling visually that someone's bad news, right? And that's exactly what Rubens is doing here. This guy is bad news. He's the opposite of Jesus. Now, he's recently back from Italy. He's channeling works of art that he'd seen. The famous 1st century AD work of Laocoon, the priest from the city of Troy, seems to have been the basis for Jesus' body, right? Not directly copying it, but very much influenced by it. We have a sketch by Rubens of this sculpture, so we know he's using it, right? But he's getting this musculature from works he had seen from the 10 years he had spent while in Italy. The last thing we'll end with here is that Rubens puts himself in the picture, right? That's a self-portrait, the soldier on the left, directly behind the evil guy. And I'm pretty sure he's intended to be St. Longinus. Remember St. Longinus? We talked about him before, right? We saw him here, okay. Saw him here. Next to the cross. He's the one who pierced Christ's side with the spear, right? Remember the legend? He was blind by legend. Didn't know what he was doing. He had to have somebody help him guide it up there. And the blood ran down the lance. The blood of Christ ran down the lance and got his hands wet. He wiped his eyes and he could miraculously see. And at which point he goes, oh my God, what have I done? And he converts. That's who Rubens is in this picture. And look at his eyes. Either he's currently blind, or he's just, whoa, wait a second. That's Jesus. That's the Savior at a moment of revelation. Right? So he's put himself here amongst the henchmen, but as the one of the group that reflects on what's happened and changes his mind. Right? We know that Rubens, from his own writings, practiced the spiritual exercises. We talked about this before. Ignatius Loyola founded the Jesuits. He had this program to get you engaged with things where you tried to imagine yourself in the scene. Taste, smell, touch, hear, see, convert, engage. Rubens done this, right? He put himself in the picture. Okay, we'll wrap up Roque Flanders. We'll move on to look at Holland on Monday, and on Monday we'll talk about the progress report, but really you should be moving forward with your research at this point, trying to find things about your painting, about its theme, figuring out some of the information that you'll use to build your term paper, right? Talk more about that, and I'll get you comments on your revised bibliographies really soon.